Cybernation Uncensored.
Hey, what's up everybody? In this crash course tutorial for Shadows of Esteren by Studio Agate, I'm going to go over the optional rule of Metamorphosis. And that's from Durg, Durg Book 1 and Book 2. Now, before I get into it, I want to give a little warning, a little spoiler warning, if you will. Now, this is not only an optional rule, but there's basically two ways that you can present it. You know, one giving the players a heads up, and then one where you kind of play it into a scenario or scene and let it kind of present itself in game and then explain afterwards. I'm going to get into that in a moment. I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that, but I wanted to give you the heads up that, you know, just the fact that you have that option to let the players know prior or during game, if you're a player, you might not want to watch this. That's the spoiler aspect. If you're a game leader, watch this. Absolutely, you should know all the options and you know, be as informed as possible. But as a player, you might not want to know about this because I think it's going to be a lot of fun if it just kind of lands in gameplay. I personally love that option. But again, there's a couple options there, so let's just get right into it. All right, like I mentioned, there's a couple ways that you can communicate this optional rule of Metamorphosis to your players. And I'm just gonna, you know, before we get into the charts and all the powers and things and what Metamorphosis is, let me just kind of read these preliminary things about communicating it with your players and a couple options there like I just kind of mentioned. So the themes of Metamorphosis and loss of the self are serious ones. As always, the leader should take care that the players are comfortable with them. So, you know, you kind of maybe want to let them know because of how serious Metamorphosis is and the fact that your character is going to warp and, well, metamorphose into something else. So if the leader and players prefer, they can instead be informed of the broad strokes of the Metamorphosis mechanics beforehand so that they can make an informed decision. So in this case, Metamorphosis can be treated just like Sanity. Players will know about the existence of this mechanic and the associated tracker, but they will not necessarily know where their characters stand on said tracker. This way, just like their character's latent mental disorder can make them doubt the veracity of their in-game perceptions, they will wonder about the extent and implications of Metamorphosis. And you know, I mentioned Sanity. Check out the Crash Course tutorial on Sanity. I absolutely love that aspect of this game. I mentioned it in the whole setting and style of this game. I've mentioned it in other videos because I love it. I love the Sanity chart and aspect and mechanics of that in this game and what it is and what it's about. And Metamorphosis pretty much plays the same way as Sanity, except instead of leaning on like the psychology and, you know, sanity aspect of the chart and the way that it can affect the gameplay and your player, this kind of leans into narrative arcs, kind of plays into the player's emotions and drive. So, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I further describe this and get into it, let's go over keeping it vague. And it has a little example here, which I think is kind of cool. And I don't know, kind of explains how Metamorphosis can work and how you can play it into the game without, you know, communicating it with the players prior to the game. Like I said, there's a couple ways that you can kind of do this. So here's a little gameplay example of how you can kind of just slip it into gameplay and then explain it vaguely afterwards. So during the course of the campaign, Rajan, the leader of the Black Feathers, has become Arwen's mortal enemy. As the region sinks into chaos, Arwen comes face to face with her nemesis and a raging fight ensues. Soon, Rajan gains the upper hand. Arwen, panting, struggles to keep her footing as the bandit is about to land a fatal blow. I'm going to go over the conditions that make Metamorphosis happen, but you can kind of tell how this situation is pretty intense and dire. You know, she's about to get hit by a fatal blow. It is then that the voice rings inside her head, mingling with her heartbeat, urging her to answer its call. With it, she feels renewed strength course within her. The leader asks Arwen's player whether she lets this force run its course. The The player answers that she does, unknowingly starting the metamorphosis process. The leader describes the resulting influx of power as this. Dribbling blood and foaming at the mouth, Arwen stands tall, her gaze fierce and ravenous, and pounces at the flabbergasted Eurasian. So you see how she, feels this calling of power, and I want to use that. And she gets out of this dire situation where she was about to be given a fatal blow. So you see how you're kind of in this scenario, and the player kind of makes the decision as the character based on that scene, based on that moment. And you have no idea about the rule. You just know about the moment that you're living through as the character. And then afterwards, let me go on here. Following this scene, the leader takes the player aside to go over the mechanics at hand. However, the leader sticks to the basics. Arwen has a new power that she can call upon whenever she desires, on the condition that it is during a tense, dramatic moment. Each use will trigger a mental resistance roll and may ultimately result in an irreversible transformation. No need to go any further into detail. The leader should even take an appropriately enigmatic air when explaining. As they approach the conclusion of the campaign, the players may grow suspicious that they get to use such great powers without any serious consequences and dread the moment when metamorphosis will take its due. So yeah, you see how you can kind of explain it after, you can explain it beforehand, and those are kind of the game leader's options. And I suggest that you just make that decision based on your relationship with your players. If you've seen any of my Game Master Tips series, you know that I'm a real avid supporter of session zeros. Make sure you have a session zero. Go over the gameplay styles with your players, see their lines and veils, and maybe hint to things like sanity and metamorphosis, and see if they really need you to kind of explain it beforehand, or if they seem cool with those kind of crazy things playing out in the game. And then that'll let you know kind of which decision you should make. But, okay, let's get into conditions. I mentioned before that there's some conditions here for metamorphosis to take place, like being in an intense, dire situation. And you can see here that there's no definitive answer to why metamorphosis happens, but the emergence of metamorphosis usually occurs as a result of the combining of several factors. High drive is one. The character has a drive of 6 or more, invested heart and soul in their quest. They find themselves able to tap into extraordinary resources. Dire straits, as we saw in that previous example I just read, the character or those dear to them are in great danger. A connection with one's personal quest can also be there. A decisive event related to the character's narrative arc unfolds. And last, an occult presence. An object of power or an occult presence manifests nearby, influencing the nature of the metamorphosis. So you see, metamorphosis doesn't just happen. And it's not that common either. You need all these conditions to kind of be happening. But as I've explained in numerous Crash Course tutorials, especially in the combat one, Shadows of Esteren is brutal. The land, the environment, the people, the Fiondas, everything that you deal with is just, it's dire to begin with. So as rare as metamorphosis is, be careful, because you can absolutely end up in situations where it will happen. It'll take place because you're just going to be lined up with a lot of these conditions. You know what I mean? When it hits, it hits. When it rains, it pours, I should say. So just like Fiondas, they might not be everywhere apparent, running rampant like other animals and bestiarity in the world of Tree Kazel, but they still exist. And then when you do come across them, it's dire, it's intense, it's life or death, And I feel like metamorphosis is the same way. As rare as it is, when it hits, it hits. So let's get into it. Let's get into the chart, the sanity chart, how the metamorphosis relates to that. Let's get into the crunch of how you work it, the arcs, the powers, all that stuff. Let's get into it. So I mentioned the sanity chart and how metamorphosis relates directly to that. You can see, and like I said, watch the sanity crash course video. I explain all of this, but ultimately, when you're in pretty crazy situations, you have to check your mental stability, basically your mental resistance. You're going to have a stat there, and I go over that in character creation, but that mental resistance that plays into sanity also plays into metamorphosis. So you see here in the sanity chart, you basically can cure these trauma points that rack up and get you into these different sections: balance, symptom, syndrome, and madness. And each one has its own things, you know, that happen along the way. Like I said, watch that crash course tutorial on sanity to better understand that. But you see here the trauma points, the different sections, how that's laid out with metamorphosis. It plays into that. But instead of balance, symptom, syndrome, madness, you have threshold, corruption, occult, and metamorphosis. And each one has its own difficulty threshold. You can see there are 11, 14, 17, 20, and that's, you know, what you got to match or beat with your mental resistance check. And I'll get into that in a moment. And then you have trauma points that you're going to get, which are metamorphosis trauma points, 1, 2, 3, and 5. And then just like insanity, you have in parentheses here where, you know, whether you fail or succeed on that mental resistance check, you have to take 1 or 2 points if you're up in that occult or metamorphosis level of power. So, okay, let's get into it a little bit deeper here. You see how you have the different levels: threshold, corruption, occult, and metamorphosis. Each one has its own power depending on which narrative arc that you're on, and each narrative arc has its own sort of thing. I'll get into that in a moment. But in each one of these levels of power, there's going to be a different sort of power that you can tap into. Each time that you tap into that power for the first time, so whichever level, the first time that you use that power, you take a permanent, and that's permanent trauma point, not temporary. If you remember in the sanity crash course tutorial, just like this, matching sanity, you get temporary points. And it's very much like taking damage, like in the combat video where you take temporary points, because you can heal. You can heal and get rid of those. But in some cases, they become permanent. And this is one of them. So anytime that you're reaching a new level of power, threshold, corruption, occult, metamorphosis, and you use that associated power for the first time, you automatically take 1 point of trauma, and that's permanent. So you have to mark that off on your chart. And let me go over the sanity chart here too, because you're going to mark sanity based on how you fill it up and your mental resistance checks for sanity specifically. But when you do it for your metamorphosis, make sure you mark it a little different. Put a slash or fill it in, or put an X if it's permanent. However you do it is fine, just as long as you can distinguish between them and keep it a little bit organized. Okay, so when you use a power for the first time, like I said, you automatically take a permanent trauma point. I'm going to get into the different checks and the ways that you can avoid the points or get points, how it works, the crit success or fail in a moment. But first, let's get into the associated symbols with these levels: threshold, corruption, occult, and metamorphosis, because that's going to come into play. You can see here the different symbols: threshold, corruption, occult, metamorphosis, and that goes into each narrative arc. So depending on which arc you're going with, and each player is going to be different. Each character is going to lean into a potential different arc based on their story, how they're playing their character, the character's history and life path. Everything comes into play to kind of set this forth. And the fact it's narrative, keep in mind that there's no right or wrong way to do this. You're creating a story together as a game leader with the players. So there's no need to do a roll to see if it happens. You just see that there's some of those conditions in place, and it just feels right, and it's dire and it's intense. And you kind of play it out in a scenario and see if the player character takes the bait, and they do it, and then you have it. You see how it's narrative. There's no right or wrong way. You work it into the story, and it's a bit nuanced. It's different depending on each character and the story and campaign at hand. But anyways, you have these symbols: threshold, corruption, occult, metamorphosis, and the reason they're there is because they're associated with the different powers that become available when you get up to those different levels. So let's get into those different levels and the different narrative arcs, because there are 4 of them here listed in Drivethru 2. I'm going to go over them, and these aren't the only ones. It absolutely says these are suggestions. So just like I've mentioned before, in combat, in healing, when it comes to diseases and things like that, There's no right or wrong way, and this is not just the be-all, end-all amount of things available. These are suggestions, so you can manipulate them to make better sense with your characters and players in the campaign and setting that you're using and playing at the time. You can also come up with new ones, make up your own. So just use these as inspiration and as at least a starter. But the first one is Berserker. So, Berserker here, you can see, and I'm not going to read all these, but you can see the 4 different powers that become available, like Visceral Bond, Superhuman Survival, things like that. And you see the different symbols as it goes up, like I said, when you're associating them with the different levels of power: Threshold, Corruption, Occult, and Metamorphosis. And don't forget, each time you get to each level and you use it for the first time, automatically you're taking a permanent trauma point. Now, each time that you're going to try to use one of these powers, and it doesn't matter which narrative arc you're on or going with, whether it's Berserker or one of the others, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. I know we're excited. I'm going to explain that. But yeah, regardless of which narrative arc you're taking and what you're doing, they're all going to kind of work the same. The first time you use a power, you take a permanent trauma point. And then after that, it's just, it depends on the role itself. Every time that you're going to try to use a power, obviously it needs to be an intense moment. The conditions need to kind of make sense to it, that you're going to be using the power. But when you use it, you're going to do a mental resistance check each time. So when you roll that, basically, if it's a success, and let's go back to this chart just so I can explain it. If it's a success, you're not going to take any trauma points. You're going to successfully use that power. You're not going to take any trauma points unless it's the ones in parentheses. Those you have to take. Now, if you roll a 10, if it's a critical success, you don't even take the parentheses points. And in fact, you get a hardening point. And let me go to that. I explain hardening points in the Sanity Crash Course tutorial, but just to give an example here, at least to show it on the chart, you can see you get trauma points, and then there's hardening points, which are, points and, what your reaction is to the same trauma, right, that you would get a trauma point from, but instead you had a great roll and you dealt with that trauma in such a way that it hardened you a little, and now you're a little tougher in those situations and it doesn't mess you up as much. So I hope that explains it. I go over that better in the Sanity Crash Course tutorial, but just to kind of give you an idea of hardening points. But ultimately, when you use the power, if you succeed, you use the power, you don't take any trauma points except what's in the parentheses. If you get a critical success, you roll a 10. You don't take any points, not even the ones in parentheses, and you get 1 hardening point. If you fail that mental resistance check, you're going to take the trauma points and you don't get to use the power. If you get a critical failure, you roll a 1. Not only do you not get to use the power, not only do you get these temporary trauma points added to your chart, but one of the temporary trauma points becomes permanent. So just make sure, again, like I mentioned, you have distinctive ways that you mark these points, so you can keep track of what's temporary, what's permanent, and then also the fact that you're using the sanity chart for sanity trauma points, and then these metamorphosis trauma points. Make sure you have different ways of marking that. The same way that I have you do it when you heal, right? When you have temporary and permanent damage points versus disease points, which last 5 days, and it's a whole different beast. Again, watch that combat crash course tutorial and the healing and alternative forms of damage crash course tutorial. I go over all that in those. But ultimately, that's the way that the points work. That's how you do your mental resistance check, depending on if you're on threshold, corruption, occult, or metamorphosis, depending on which difficulty threshold you have to beat. And whether you get a crit success or crit failure is pretty important, because getting a hardening point is way different than getting a permanent trauma point. So yeah, it's going to come down to the dice in those situations. But okay, let's get back to Berserker. Let's go over these different narrative arcs, right? So Berserker's the first one, and as you see, like I said, each one's going to have different powers, and you can come up with more. You can alter these. Nothing is set in stone. These are merely suggestions, but let's go over that. Berserker. So this metamorphosis path is tied to the narrative arc of love. To save the person they love, the character stops at nothing. Their willpower transcends human limitations. With each step of their transformation, they grow imperceptibly and their body thickens. Their eyes shine with an ice-cold glow as metamorphosis progresses and ultimately devours them. They become an inhuman war machine. So yeah, and I can't pass up showing off some of the art. There's a little art spoiler from Durg 2, but there's a Berserker. But you can see that one is tied to love. Now, the next narrative arc is Spectre. And again, you can see you've got the different symbols here representing the different levels of power. And, you know, you access these as you rank up. And keep in mind, just to reiterate, let's go back to the sanity chart just so it's clear. You know, as you fill these up, that's how you get access to those different levels. You see there's basically 5 circles to fill in balance, in symptom, in syndrome, and madness. As you fill those up and you get into the next section, you get access to that section's power. And, you know, as you lose these trauma points, or I should say metamorphosis trauma points, because if they're temporary, you can remove them with therapy and things like that. I go over that in the sanity chart or crash course or sanity crash course tutorial. But, you know, as if they're temporary and you're removing them, as you go down in these sections from, you know, symptom to balance, you lose access to that power under symptom from your narrative arc. So, yeah, so keep that in mind. You only have access to the powers based on the level of the metamorphosis chart, you know, where you are at in the chart. But here's Spectre. You can see the powers there, and let's just read this one a little bit. This metamorphosis path is tied to the narrative arc of guilt and implies that the character bears the burden for the loss of someone dear to them. So you see, like, each one is kind of tied to a different thing. There's another image there of a Spectre. Oh, and you know, something cool I do want to mention there with Spectre, because each one kind of talks about how it progresses and they become more and more like that arc, you know, that metamorphosis path, right? And in this one it says, let me just get down to the last thing because I thought it was pretty fun. Let's see. As the metamorphosis progresses, the character's occult quest leads them to join the lost person in what they think is the realm of the dead, even if it means abandoning their body and becoming a ghost in turn. I just think that's crazy. It's dark. So, like, imagine metamorphosing your character into a Spectre, and, you know, you end up literally leaving your body, you know, dying and becoming a ghost as you metamorphose. But anyways, okay, let's keep moving on here. The next arc is a Strix. You can see the powers there. This one's pretty much associated with fossil fuels. This one's very Magientist associated. And make sure you check out that deep dive on Magientist or the Crash Course tutorial where I go over that. But these powers involve fossil flux. And let's just get into what drives this arc. This metamorphosis path is tied to a narrative arc of ethics. The character's interest in science and magience gradually morphs into an obsession with flux, then into a predatory hunger for vital energy. Due to the influence of the serpent's gaze, the concerned flux is of the fossil variety, but it could be of any other type in a different context. So again, it shows you how, you know, you can put it in different contexts. You can absolutely change this to fit your campaign, to fit your player's character. It doesn't always have to be fossil fuel or exactly a narrative arc of ethics. You can kind of adjust this to make more sense. But again, the Strix one is going to be more leaning towards Magience and a Magientist. So you want to keep it more ethics and more, you know, science-based, I guess, is the right word to use, and kind of the clash between morality and science, maybe. And yeah, let's get a little image there of a Strix. Again, I love the art in Shadows of Esteren. They put such effort into their art. All their books are just absolutely amazing and beautiful. Okay, the last narrative story arc here is Apostle. And an Apostle is probably going to lean more towards, you know, the temple. It's going to have to do with those characters. Just like that last one is more Magientist associated. This one's probably more associated with the temple, which makes sense. So this metamorphosis path is tied to the narrative arc of adoption. As the character learns more about their history, they meet a group of believers that kindles a new faith in them and changes their perception of the world. So you can see there, it has to do with adoption. Adopted by a group, probably leaning into the religion, really leaning into the god and of the temple, if that's, you know, what your character is based on. And oh yeah, the last thing here, within the context of Durg, keeping in mind this is this optional rule of metamorphosis came from Durg. It's the campaign Durg Book 1 and Book 2. Book 2 at the current time of releasing this video, the Kickstarter is still up. It's just getting ready to end. So excited about that. But But yeah, you can see here within the context of Durg, the character is connected to Argan the prophet and to the serpent's gaze regarding both the prophet and the relic as holy. And if you remember the conditions of being around an occult relic or an occult group or so, that's what this has to do with. And I don't want to spoil too much by explaining it too much as far as its relation to Durg, the actual campaign, the book itself. But you get the point there. You get the idea of an apostle. So, yeah, let's go over adapting to arcs, because, you know, this plays into like what I was saying, that there's no right or wrong way, right? So by default, every metamorphosis path is associated with a particular narrative arc. To better fit their players, the leader can make adjustments customized for their campaign's characters, or even come up with their own metamorphosis paths. And I love that. You know, I've said this 100 times. I'm going to say it 1,000 times by the end of this entire series. I absolutely love Shadows of Esteren and what Studio Agate has done here, and the fact that it's very role-play heavy, it's not very crunch heavy, and like a lot of this is optional. They're very flexible to make it your own. You know, you have your world, you have your lore, you have your setting, everything is there, and it's beautiful, it's immersive, you can feel it, but it's flexible, and I love that. You know, you can make it your own. It's so important to have fun. But let me give a little example here. Just because, you know, we went over those, not conditions, but we went over those arcs, and it kind of talks about that a little bit here. For example, the Berserker might be adapted to a narrative arc of ambition, in which case the character's boundless lust for power and achievements would drive them to overcome their physical limitations in order to get rid of any obstacles in their path. So you see how, like, instead of driven by love or whatever, maybe they're driven by ambition, you know, for success or whatever they're pursuing. So you see, like, you can kind of change it. It doesn't have to be specific to that arc. You can have it make sense to the character or your specific campaign. So yeah, just check that out and know that you can adapt a metamorphosis to any narrative arc. You know, have fun, have it make sense. Let's see here. The last thing I want to go over is Transcendence, and Transcendence is important. Basically, you know, as you're racking up that chart and you're filling them up, you're getting all these points, temporary, some are turning permanent, and you're filling it up, and over time, you know, you're going to get enough permanent points and probably enough temporary. You're going to have a full chart. Once that chart is full, you transcend. So I want to read this, I want to explain this, and then I want to give my own little idea or thought. I don't know where this is going, right? What Studio Agate has planned for this. But I have my own interpretation here, and I have my own little theory, and I want to express it, and then I want you to leave me a comment and see if you agree. Okay, so first let's talk about Transcendence, right? The powers related to this ultimate step of metamorphosis become apparent, though fleeting, states. The Berserker becomes a wild half-man, half-beast being for the duration of the fight. The Spectre becomes temporary, capable of speaking with the dead, etc. So you see how that kind of plays out. Now, once this chart completely fills, once you know, it gets more and more, and you become more and more like your narrative arc, like that Berserker, like that Strix, like that Spectre, etc. You know, as that fills up, you become more and more engulfed in this metamorphosis. And once it's 100% filled up, like I said, you transcend. What happens then is you're going to basically do one mental resistance check at a difficulty of 17. However, this 17 is also, let's see, let me just read this direct. I don't want to get this wrong. This is important because this is going to show you how difficult this is going to be. If the sanity tracker of a character touched by metamorphosis is entirely filled with permanent trauma points, they must immediately pass a difficulty 17 mental resistance check with a penalty. This is the part, all right, with a penalty equal to their number of metamorphosis touched permanent trauma points, or else experience a definitive transformation, Transcendence. The Berserker never reverts from the bestial shape. The Spectre dies of a heart failure and becomes one of the ghosts that haunt the world of the living. The Strix turns into an unquenchable predator. The Apostle's body mutates catastrophically, becoming an amalgamate of flesh and pulsating organs. However, should the character pass the decisive check, They henceforth keep using their powers without risking acquiring other trauma points or being transformed. So in the rare case, that you're going to pass that difficulty 17 with a penalty equal to all those permanent points, I can't even imagine. You'd have to like crit success and like, I don't know how you'd get through that. That'd be so difficult, absolutely difficult. But if you succeed past that, from there on, you get to use the powers anytime you want, with no more trauma points being taken. Like, wow, that's intense. But that's rare, okay? And so is transcending. You got to get a full chart, and once you do, you're going to transcend. And it says here, this is the part where I have a little theory, and I want you in the comments to kind of let me know what you think. But it says here, such cases are rare, turning the concerned individuals into grim creatures, hunted or worshipped depending on the cultures they encounter. These entities usually die prematurely, consumed by their own power. Some would say that such a death is but a new step in their transformation, but none can say for sure. Okay, so here's what I'm getting out of that. I think that, once you get to this point, you're going to have a super difficult time trying to beat that 17 with all those penalties, and it's going to be very, very, very rare that you're going to just pass it and you're going to get to use powers and still be your normal self and just, succeed past that transcendence with the metamorphosis, still get to benefit from all that. That's going to be such a slim chance. But if you transcend, which is still rare, it's still rare to, fill up this entire chart and to go through all this. But if you get to that point, I feel like you become this thing that, like it said, depending on which cultures you run into, they're either going to hate you or they're going to love you. They're going to worship you like some crazy godlike thing, or they're going to kill you because they fear you, right? But then it talks about you dying young, and some thinking it's just basically a new step of the transformation. I have a theory. I think this is what creates Feondas. With Feondas, they don't know where they came from. They know that era of time back in Tree-Kazel when they all were coming out and, going all over the peninsula, and it was like a big war and a battle time, and there's giant ones and everything. And then it kind of died down from that time way back in the history of Tree-Kazel, and now in modern times in Tree-Kazel, Feons are rare, but they exist. They're here and there, but it's not like back then. I think that's what it is. I think it's transcendence. I think it's the people of Tree-Kazel morphing into Feons. They transcend, and the metamorphosis just warps them into these arcs, and each one's a different arc with different motivations. If it just sounds familiar to Feondas, I don't know. It's my theory. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it is. Again, it's just me just kicking out my theory, and I don't know. We'll see what the future holds with Studio Agate and Shadows of Esteren, and we'll see where it goes. But ultimately, there's Metamorphosis. Again, it's an optional rule. I love it. I'm going to use it in all my games. It's not optional. It's definite for my gameplay. I love it. Just like Sanity. I love that aspect of the game. So there you have it. It's optional. Feel free to use it or not use it. It's from Durg, Book 1 and Book 2. And let me know what you think in the comments. And also, make sure you like and share this video. I could really use the support here at the channel. And every little like, every comment, every sub, it helps us in the algorithm on YouTube, and it helps us get more exposure for not only myself and our channel here and what we do, but also for Studio Agate and this amazing game, Shadows of Esteren. So please make sure you show some support, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.
Cyberpunk Uncensored.